It's an election year and politicians are talking about taxes. Those on the political left generally say that the rich are not paying their fair share and that taxes should be increased. Those on the political right are generally saying that lower taxes rev up the economy. And of course, most of us complain that taxes are too high. Hi, I'm Richard Nelson, the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, and thank you for joining the Commonwealth Matters, where today we're going to talk tax policy with Brian Domitrovic, the Richard S. Strong Scholar at the Laffer Center, which promotes the core tenets of supply-side economics and educates people on free market ideas. Brian previously served as the chair of the Department of History at Sam Houston State. He's also the co-author of the recent book, Taxes Have Consequences, an Income Tax History of the United States, which is the topic of our conversation today. Brian, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
Hey, I appreciate the book you just came out with, Taxes Have Consequences. Had a chance to begin reading it. By the way, just full disclosure, I am not an economist. I am not a numbers person, but I do pay taxes, and I think that we pay too much in taxes. And your book helps us to understand what tax policy does, not just on a personal level, but what it does to our economy and to certain segments of the population. It's a very readable book, and I do appreciate you joining us to talk further about this. Brian, tell us what prompted you to write about the income tax history of the United States.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a historian. I mean, I've been writing about the history of supply-side economics of the Great Reagan Revolution in economic policy from the 1970s and 80s for a long time, at least 15, 20 years. And it occurred to me and to Arthur Laffer and Jeannie Sinkfield, who are my co-authors in Taxes Have Consequences, that if you investigate the entire history of the income tax, which goes back exactly 111 years, back to 1913, you can really kind of disprove all these kind of common left-wing, liberal, progressive verities about the income tax, such as that if you raise taxes on the rich, you collect more revenue. Of course not. So we embarked on writing it mainly because we saw some left-wingers, Manuel Saez and Thomas Piketty in particular, saying all these kind of unbelievable things about taxation, that the great eras were high tax eras. And we said, no, we know the history. And that's why we wrote the book.
Okay, very good. So up until 1913, there was no federal tax, federal progressive income tax, that is. What was the impetus that led our federal government to propose that? Of course, the Constitution had to be amended in order to allow the federal government to impose an income tax, and that was the 16th Amendment that was proposed, passed by Congress, ratified by the states. What was the impetus behind that?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question in American history, and I think it's really understudied for all the historians we have. We actually did not embark too much upon that question in the book about why it happened in 1909 to 1913. I have some of my own views about that are maybe a little bit speculative or adventuresome, but why not? I mean, I'll treat you to some of them. Yeah, I think. I mean, the main revenue sources for the federal government in 1912 were the tariff, about 67%. And then alcohol and tobacco taxes for about the other third, maybe 10% other taxes. Total government spending was maybe 6% across all levels of government. Today it's 35. So certainly one reason that the federal government adopted an income tax was so that it could get big. When you tax the domestic population as opposed to the foreign population, you already have hold of your taxpayers. You don't have hold of foreigners by definition. So when the tariff was the principal revenue engine, the United States government had to be small because the taxes were completely voluntary. Foreigners had to come here to volunteer to pay the tax. So one reason was the government wanted to get big. And why did it want to get big? Government wants to get big. Well, immediately, what did the United States government do over the next generation? Immediately, it fought two huge foreign wars. So I think the first reason the United States passed the income tax was so that it could launch itself into foreign wars. I think that's the first reason. And I think the second reason was to put to bed the Civil War. I consider the 16th Amendment the last of the Civil War amendments. I mean, it was exactly on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and there were all sorts of events in 1913 expressing the reconciliation between North and South. I mean, the Gettysburg battlefield handshakes across the veterans in 1913. And the income tax was structured so that virtually it was almost just the Yankees, just the New York Yankees who would pay it. The very richest people who were all in the former Union states. And I think it was a gesture to overcome the tariff, which the South had hated, and to kind of bind up the nation's wounds in Lincoln's sense. And then together, jointly, to go on a great adventure, and that was the World Wars.
That's a fascinating explanation. And of course, you did see that it brought together the states in a cohesive way. When there was a strong federal government, it really made us a national people instead of a state-centered people. And it did increase the size of government, which I think is, as a people, Brian, we have been skeptical of big government. We've been skeptical of powerful government. This is what led us to separate from Great Britain. And of course, then we allowed the government to not just tax us, to give the federal government income taxing authority, but to grow to a huge state. You've said that a third, 35% of our incomes, what was that? 35% of our income is going to support government at various levels. Is that correct?
Yeah, right now at all levels, state level, state, local, federal. I mean, state government basically didn't exist back then, maybe 0.5% of GDP. I mean, I actually believe that the income tax in the United States caused World War I. I mean, it gave the rest of the world the surety that the United States would come in to save them if they did something crazy. So they did, and then the United States came in and saved them. Same thing in World War II. So no, I think it was kind of a malignant development. If the United States had not passed the income tax in 1913, I actually take seriously the notion that Europe would not have started World War I.
Now, of course, when the income tax was enacted, it only affected the highest wage earners, and the rate on these highest wage earners was between 1% to 7%. To me, just looking at that, it seems to me that there was class envy there. We'll just tax the rich, right? And it's going to be at a small rate. Why not, if you're going to be fair and just with our laws, shouldn't there be a tax on everybody? Of course, that wouldn't have passed. That would not have gone through. But yet they looked at the high wage earners and they said it's a low rate. The reason I bring that up is because to me, that seems to drive so much of the discussion over tax policy today. Well, the rich aren't paying their fair share. We hear President Biden talk about this frequently. The rich just need to pay their fair share. There's this class envy, maybe class warfare mentality, which is destructive to any nation. And you do talk about what leads to civil war and to conflicts. And it is this argument over the taxes and over wages and over how much the government should get. Do you see that as being the core of, let's say, far left political ideology? Just it's this class warfare. We just need to, the rich need to pay their fair share. Is that part of their ideology, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly become that, and it quickly became that in the era of the income tax. I fear that at the time, the rich kind of volunteered for it. I mean, if you read Andrew Mellon's, just the single most remarkable treatise ever written about taxation in American history is Andrew Mellon's 1924 book, Taxation, the People's Business. Andrew Mellon was basically the richest person in the world at that point, maybe Rockefeller. And he was Secretary of the Treasury, and he could certainly watch the income tax come into existence, 1909 to 1913. He thought in that book and in lots of statements, he was a laconic individual, of course, that taxation could be removed as a political issue if the rich just picked up the bill. But the key thing was that the bill had to be small, had to be less than 10%, less than a religious tithe. Because he demonstrated that religions had long shown for millennia that if there's a really well invested civilization, if people really care about the religion, adore it, just let it guide their their life, they will volunteer to pay a 10% tax. So if we really like the United States of America, we think it's the last best hope of earth, all that stuff, you can tax the rich at under 10% and they'll volunteer for it. And that would remove the issue of taxation from the body politic, that contentious issue, which probably gave us the Civil War, to talk about the Southern perspective, which was still very active. Today, we don't take seriously. We laugh at the idea that the tariff caused the Civil War. Well, that's not the way a lot of people thought about it in 1913. And there was a sense, well, why don't we just have the Yankees just with their riches pick up pay 7% of their income? And the rich people said, okay, let's do that if we can just displace all this sectional conflict. So I think the rich were actually complicit in starting the income tax. Then, of course, it got completely out of control. The top rate of the income tax was 11 times higher, 77% in 1918, and then all bets were off.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit, how the progressive income tax progressed. So you just mentioned that the highest tax rate, 77% since 1913?
Yeah, so you went to 77% in 1918.
Okay, so let's talk about what does that mean in practical terms. When we talk about a 77% tax rate, that means that people get to keep 23% or 23 cents of every dollar, correct?
That's exactly what that means.
So the top tax rate has been above 60% from 1932 to 1980. And then from 1987 to 2020, that tax rate dropped a bit. The top tax rate ranged from 28 to 40%. Now, you argue that there is a strong correlation between strong economic growth and lower tax rates. And yet we don't hear this. You mentioned it just a few minutes ago that those on the political left, or maybe historical revisionists, say that that's not the case. Tell us about this correlation between strong economic growth and lower tax rates.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that really is the meat of the book, I have to tell you. So the tax rate was zero. Income tax rate was zero prior to 1913, say 1912. And, that era was the greatest period of economic growth that the world has ever seen. So from 1789, when the nation was founded, through 1912, the United States redefined what it meant to grow as a mass society. So zero corresponded with incredible growth. All right, so now you have a tax system from 1913 to 1929, and 1913 to 1921 was bad. You had the wartime, which completely diminished private production, which is the stuff of economic growth. You had a nasty recession, probably the worst in American history, from 1919 to 21. And then as the top tax rate went down from 73% in 1921 via Andrew Mellon down to 25% over the next 4 years, you had the roaring 20s. So as tax rates went down, boom. In 1930, the United States decides to raise taxes again, first the tariff, and then January 1st, 32, the income tax rate up by 150%, Great Depression. So the correlation was very clear through the first 30 years of the income tax. After World War II, when income tax rates statutorily are very high, there's no real determination on the part of the government to collect those revenues. So income tax rates were 80, 90% in the latter 40s, the 1950s and early 60s, in which there's pretty good economic growth in many cases, but there's no enforcement of those rates. I mean, federal tax collections on the income tax side were at most, 8%. Total federal spending maybe reached 16%. Heck, in 1948, it was 11%. Down by 3/4 from 1944. So, government was shrinking, and there was just so many loopholes that they made the tax rates irrelevant.
Kentucky is at a crossroads. We can choose to give in to the radical left, or we can choose to engage the culture in a God-honoring way.
I started the Commonwealth Policy Center because I believe that Christians have a responsibility to influence government and society to the glory of God. While the Commonwealth Policy Center's made a significant impact, our work isn't finished. If you'd like to join our movement working for timeless values, then head to our website.
To learn more, go to commonwealthpolicycenter.org.
Good. If you're just joining us, you are tuned into the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson here with Brian Domitrovic, the co-author of the book Taxes Have Consequences, and we are talking about tax policy. Brian, the rich are often maligned in this country. Uh, we see it regularly in the news. But you say in your book, you say that the highest earners and the rich are the stewards of the economy. And because of it, we've had incredible growth and development in the modern world. They bring investment capital, managerial experience, and entrepreneurial vision. They bring workforces together. And because of this, all of society benefits. And what you're saying is true. It's verified, but it's not articulated when people talk about tax policy. They just look at it, they reduce it into a simplistic formula of somebody has more, they've accumulated this great wealth, and they must be taxed. We're questioning, how did they get it? Was it fair how they got it? And therefore they must be taxed. But what you say here, their entrepreneurial vision, they can manage the company, they can hire people, they can bring a workforce together. We miss all of that in our conversations, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, a progressive income tax, especially one with high rates, focuses attention on the rich, because if you're going to tax people according to their level of income, more tax rates, higher the income, then that's who we have to focus on. Then the tax system is targeting those who are making high income. So we made the top 1%, therefore, the primary focus of our book. You have a progressive tax system with rates going up to the 90% in American history. We're going to look how the 1% responded. And we found from 1913 to the present that whenever the rich are targeted with really high taxes, they do a number of things. Number one, they just earn less income. It's like, whoa, you're going to tax me more, I'm not going to earn as much. That's a perfectly natural response. They don't need the money. They're the top 1%. They already have it packed away. So the first thing they do is they don't earn as much. The second thing that they do is that they decide that, well, if I'm still going to, whatever I do earn, I'm going to shelter from taxation legally. And then the third result is, because the rich aren't earning as much, and because they have changed their behavior to shelter their income, everyone else is worse off. Because the rich, in fact, are the stewards of the economy. They are the ones who are earning the most money because of entrepreneurial vision or because of managing businesses. So if they decide to scale back, number one, and number two, to change their activities to suboptimal activities, that there are tax shelters, the chance that people will be employed or flourish who are not 1% is severely diminished. That's why we had the Great Recession. That's why we had the Great Depression and all the kind of washouts and unemployment that we've had since 1913, because the tax system attacked the rich.
Interesting, Brian. I've not heard that argument before. That's fascinating. Something to think about. However, our national debt is at $32 trillion. We are slated to begin paying, I believe, $1 trillion just to service that debt because of increasing interest rates and just the sheer amount there. I think within a couple of years, the debt service payments are going to be $1 trillion. Look, we're heading towards the fiscal cliff. Is there a way out of this? And here's where I'm going to, connecting with the last point. If we continue this debt spiral that we're in, we're no longer going to be that reserve currency. Our currency will not be valued if we cannot pay on that debt, correct?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the debt is kind of ludicrous. And I think that's just an expression of the government's jealousy against the private economy. I mean, if the government knows, look at the 1990s, if it starts running balanced budgets and surpluses, the government debt shrinks. It's a non-existence. Alan Greenspan gave a famous speech in 2001, said, hey, look, we'll just run 4 straight years of surpluses. In no time flat, the Federal Reserve will not be able to conduct open market operations because there won't be a sufficient amount of government debt out there. Alan Greenspan gave that speech. It was totally accurate only 23 years ago in 2001. So the government has a vested interest in kind of breaking the economy with lots of debt. If it just started balancing the budget, running a modest surplus, just balance the budget. In no time flat, the debt problem would be eliminated. And that shows that, kind of the government's jealous of the private economy. It's just scared of the economy really growing like crazy and just being way bigger than the federal government. And that's where I get back to the virtue infusion. It's the founding fathers. You got to have virtuous people in government. Your purpose in life, people in government, is to be small. So get small.
So where are we in relation to being to heading over that fiscal cliff? Are we at a point of no return? $32 trillion. I can't get my mind around that large of a number. It doesn't seem like there's any way out of that. We do know that there is a breaking point for a government that gets itself head over heels into debt, when it cannot pay the interest payments, when it cannot pay its bills that it owes to its creditors, then the economy collapses, doesn't it? We've seen this throughout history. Are we heading to that place, Brian?
I think it's very easy to solve. I think if the budget were balanced, and if we had spending levels of 2019, I mean that's only yesterday, we balance budget like that. And a balanced budget means you're always paying off your debt. I mean, most of the debt is short-term debt, so your debt's going down immediately if you're balancing budget because you're paying it off. That's a budget item. So if you balance the budget for any time at all, the debt problem would evaporate as having any significance. I mean, the wealth in the United States, I think the Federal Reserve accounts for it now, is about $175 trillion, $175 trillion, the private wealth of the United States. And what the total debt of the American government is 35 trillion, let's just say. Well, I mean, if you balance the budget, you would stop accumulating that debt. In fact, you start paying it down, and you'd have this extreme explosion in the total net worth of the country, and that ratio would just gape. That's what happened in the 1990s. It's not like there's not any kind of model of how to deal with this. Everyone said, oh, Reagan's going to kill our grandchildren with his debt. We started running budget surpluses in the 1990s. The whole problem was gone in no time flat. So, it's easily solvable. All you have to do is balance the budget.
And Brian, a lot of people have given up hope on the federal government. I haven't, but our focus at the Commonwealth Policy Center is on state government. We can have a greater impact here in the state of Kentucky. Now, the Commonwealth is on track to phase out the state income tax. Just 2-3 years ago, it was at 6%. Right now, it's at 3.5%. And it's on track of being phased out within the next couple of years, so long as the state reaches certain benchmarks. How can we expect this to impact our state economy by phasing out that state income tax?
Sure. Well, Richard, if Kentucky succeeds in that, it would be absolutely historic because no state has ever eliminated its income tax outside of trivial exceptions. So I'm pessimistic, if I may say so. All sorts of states have pledged to do that. Ohio is pledging to do it right now. So is Iowa. Arizona pledged to do it in the 1990s. No one has ever succeeded in doing that. So if it does happen, that would be just kind of epic. I mean, I would expect a tremendous capital rush into Kentucky, but not until then, because the investment community maintains a complete healthy skepticism about state level reform. As I mentioned, states accounted essentially for 0% of GDP in revenue as of 1900, maybe, less than 1%. And now they're 9% of GDP. So state government shouldn't exist at all. So to the extent it exists, which is, pushing 10% of GDP, the states don't know what they're doing. You kind of have to just completely get out of the business of government. So I'll believe it when I see it.
Well, you burst my bubble. I was optimistic that we were going to actually see this state income tax phased out. However, they have made progress. They have reduced it 2 separate occasions. This year's biannual budget, they're set to reduce it again down to, I believe, 3%. So we are on track. We've made some headway. Look, I'd rather pay 3% than 6% state income tax. So we'll see. Maybe Kentucky can be the first state to achieve this. Brian, I want to talk about another aspect of tax policy. When people are allowed to keep more of their income that they earn, they're able to, of course, invest, buy more, provide for their family, and also give. And this is what I want to talk about. When people have resources, they're able to not just use it for themselves and their families, but they're able to give. In America, the United States is a very giving nation, isn't it? And this is possible because we have a robust economy and people have created wealth and they've saved, but they also give. Can you speak to that, the importance of wealth creation in its relation to giving?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, with marginal income in particular, I mean, there's a particular propensity to give and to invest with the next dollar of income that you earn, especially, and that's what happens when you cut progressive tax rates. You keep what you've already been making, then what you earn more, you keep more of. And that's exactly the dollar that goes to philanthropy, that goes to new investments, and very little of it to kind of common consumption. So, yeah, I mean, marginal tax rates cuts have everything to do with increased philanthropy. I mean, just what was the country's philanthropic status quo as of 1912, the year before the income tax? I mean, indescribable philanthropy at that point in history. And again, that's why I assume one of the ulterior motives of government to start an income tax is because, government was jealous of private philanthropy and, tries to set itself up as this kind of do-gooder itself, this kind of conscience, the pseudo-conscience of the nation. So, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons government has to cut marginal tax rates is because the proper philanthropists are the private sector.
Brian, it's been a joy having you on the Commonwealth Matters. Appreciate what you have done with your book, Taxes Have Consequences. Where can people find your book?
Oh, it's kind of everywhere. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. They sell it. All the indie bookstores, that's you can find it.
Okay, very good. Brian Domitrovic, thank you so much for joining us on the Commonwealth Matters. God bless and keep up the great work. And if you're just tuning in, again, you're listening to the Commonwealth Matters, please go to your favorite podcast platform and like us, and then tell your friends about this program. That's a great way to help others to get to know who we are and what we're doing. Thanks again for tuning in, and God bless you.